Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program. And I have with me my colleague Tanmay, who is a research intern with the High-Tech Geopolitics program. Today, we have a special guest with us, Dr. Walter Ladwig. He's a senior lecturer in international relations at the Department of War Studies in King's College, London. Dr. Ladwig is a political scientist specializing in US foreign policy, South Asian security, irregular warfare, and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much, Dr. Ladwig, for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Thank you. So today we're going to discuss a very interesting paper authored by Dr. Ladwig called Parliamentary Interest in Foreign Security Politics, Insights from the Lok Sabha. So this paper presents a detailed investigation into how and why members of parliament in India engage with foreign security policy. So the first question is why India, right? So as you mentioned in your paper, India is often viewed as an executive dominant system, especially in foreign affairs. From an institutional standpoint, India is not a setting where parliamentarians would be expected to have a high degree of engagement with foreign security policy, as with other Westminster-style governments. The executive has, a lot of freedom of action on defense and foreign affairs. So why did you choose India as the focus for this legislative study?
It's a great question. And to answer that, I have to take maybe two steps back because the answer does have roots in academic literature. And the first thing to say is there's been a long-standing academic debate and discussion about the effects of being a democracy on a country's ability to make foreign policy and make defense decisions. And so there's been a concern among small c conservatives for a long time that democracy is a problem for good national security policy. And some people would go all the way back to the Peloponnesian War and look at the behavior of the Athenians and the failed Sicilian campaign and their shortcomings versus Sparta. I think a lot of people who were writing about this topic in the early Cold War period looked at the Third Republic in France and their failures to sort of properly prepare against the rising Nazi threat. And basically felt that democracies led to sort of fecklessness, they were irresolute, they flip-flopped constantly, and all of that was really bad. Now, coming from the other perspective, one of the interesting things that came out of the democratic peace literature in the 1990s and the 2000s was an observation that when democracies went to war, they actually tended to win the wars that they fought. And so quantitatively, we know that from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 up through the 1990s, because that's when these folks were writing, democracies tended to win about 80% of the wars they fought. So you have these two really conflicting views, right? On the one hand, democracy is bad for national security. And on the other hand, democracies tend to be quite successful. And so there was a really important paper that Vipin Narang at MIT and Paul Stanlin at the University of Chicago wrote, trying to theorize about why this happened. Like, how do we reconcile these two things? And they put forth this idea of democratic accountability theory. And they said that the two factors that really matter is how salient, how electorally salient is a particular foreign policy or national security issue, and how clear is the electorate able to hold someone to account for bad decision making? And to answer your question, they used India as the test case for their theory. So they brought examples from Indian national security decision making and policy. So one of the reasons why I wanted to look at the context of India was that this really important new theoretical framework also focused on India, and they talked particularly about some specific issue areas. So they theorized that Pakistan, which has a high resonance with the public, would be one where politicians would pay attention to. China, at various points in time, could be considered sort of high or low. And then a topic area that they said would really never get much attention would be things like weapons procurement and those sort of technical issues, because the population doesn't care so much. So that was kind of one really big motivation. And then the second, as someone who works on India in the defense and national security space, is that there's a received wisdom that parliamentarians don't care very much, that they don't have much knowledge, that it doesn't matter to the public, so therefore there's not a lot of attention. And I really wanted to kind of question that assumption and really look at what evidence do we have when they engage, do they engage, what topics do they engage with? So it sort of worked from two directions. One, it allows you to speak to these new innovations in theory, but also to really, from a practical standpoint, expand our knowledge about India-specific issues, the way the Lok Sabha operates, what the Defense Committee does, and so forth.
Right. Yes. I think you've raised some very important points, and it's important to question this traditional idea that we have of India, right? As not only a population, but very specifically a political population that is obsessed with domestic affairs and not as much as with foreign affairs. So before we move on to more interesting findings from your paper, I just had a question on the methodology, because it's fascinating. You've compiled a data set of more than 10,000 parliamentary questions, more than 1,000 unique MPs, and you've done this across 15 years. So I guess, I want to know, what are the challenges of having done this?
So it's thank you for recognizing that, because there has been a lot of work that's gone into this. And again, I think this is also, if I would add to the motivations, is creating original data that other scholars could potentially use. Now, luckily, as with many things, you do have shoulders to stand on. So groups like PRS Legislative, they do compile data on MPs and their backgrounds and their histories. So that helped get you started. And although I am not a coder myself, I was able to hire research assistants who were able to scrape the Lok Sabha website, and that was fairly easy. But you have to do a lot of work to create these things. And again, it's I think a frustration as a scholar who works on India and would love to see India much more mainstream in terms of data that other researchers have to make use of. One of the reasons why India sometimes gets ignored or sidelined is it's not easy. The information's there, right? It exists in various places, but no one's gone to the trouble of compiling it and bringing it together. Whereas a scholar of comparative politics can just, easily find UK, US, sometimes you even read papers where they test their theories against, massive countries like Iceland or New Zealand. And they do it because the data is easy to hand, right? And so it exists in India, but it's rarely put together in a way that makes it possible for researchers. So I do hope that beyond the findings themselves, I hope this creates an opportunity for other, smarter people to look at this data and do good things with it.
Yeah, so again, before we move on to the findings, I have another question on methodology.
Sure.
So my question is on your tool of choice, right? Why parliamentary questions specifically? And I would also like you to elaborate a little bit on other parliamentary activities like speeches or something that may show different results or that may complement these results that we found in your paper, if those are analyzed. So I would like to know your views on those.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So there's a couple of reasons for parliamentary questions. One is to say that this is a tool that is fairly ubiquitous in parliaments around the world. So not just Westminster-style parliaments, but I think we could say that the United States Congress and Senate are essentially outliers in sort of not having a tool, but almost every other democratic parliamentary configuration has such a tool of some form or another. So that's very attractive then, because that allows comparability, and that would allow other researchers to then look and put India in context to various other states. So that's one thing. The second is that in many democracies, and India is by no means an outlier here, the behavior of parliamentarians is often constrained by their parties. So whether or not they can give speeches, who gets to participate in debates, a lot of these introducing legislation, like a lot of these activities are often tightly controlled. And so, if we're trying to get to grips with what parliamentarians signal they're interested in via their behavior, parliamentary questions, again, around the world and in India, are comparatively seen as one of the freest areas, right? So that they do have a fairly free ability to put in the questions that they want and address the topics they're interested in, whereas, speeches and debates may be much more constrained. So we'd be dealing, the data would be incomplete there. And then the third is that because there's so many thousands and thousands that are offered, all the policy topics are sort of at hand, and it gives us a fair representation. Whereas, again, debates and speeches, there can only be so many, and so if you just looked at those, they'd be somewhat truncated. Now, to answer the second part of your question, I haven't gone through a comprehensive analysis of what it would look like if you focused on those, but I can say I have done at least a rudimentary correlation, and questions are fairly different, right? So people who the correlation between sort of the number of debates you participate in, if you try to put forward private members' bills, things like that, they are different, right? So the profile of MPs who ask a lot of questions could be different from those who participate in debates, who try to sponsor original legislation and so forth. So there is a chance that that you would get some different results, but I haven't had a chance to explore it fully.
Right. Okay, I think we've gotten good insights about the methodology of your research. So let's come to the first conclusion that really surprised me a lot, right? So one of those findings, those surprising findings, is that marginal MPs or MPs with lower security on their seats engage more with foreign security policy. Could you shed some light on why this is the case? And is the hypothesis that marginal MPs are trying to appear more active true, or is there genuine constituent interest by these MPs?
So this is one of the big findings that was the opposite of what I hypothesized, right? So going in, the paper hypothesized that if the public didn't care very much, that it would actually be very secure MPs who could afford to engage with these topics. And so what we find, as you've said, is the exact opposite. And what it does appear to be the case is that, as the paper also examines, in general, MPs who are more insecure ask more questions. They show more activity. So I do think it is a way of trying to signal to constituents or to show that they are active members of parliament. And I have examples of MPs who put on their websites, or even including campaign videos, the number of questions that they've asked. So they clearly think on some levels that resonates with a particular segment of the electorate. Now, the interesting thing is, this finding that they engage more with foreign security policy is still relevant, right? So it's not just captured by the fact that they ask more questions in general, because we do find that there's a lot of issue areas where there isn't an electoral connection. So commerce, communication, home affairs, railways, power, shipping, those ministries don't get more questions asked to them simply because an MP is insecure. So again, it's something that needs to be explored in future research, but there does appear to be the case that asking questions about foreign affairs and asking questions about defense are seen as a type of question that might get your name in the paper, get some kind of interest and attraction. And we do know that sometimes parliamentary questions become the basis of media stories, and that can, again, get an MP perhaps some degree of attention.
Following up on that a little bit, do you think it would be interesting to see how the results for that play out? Like, would it be interesting to see that marginal MPs who ask these type of questions, if they actually win the seats, or if there's any difference in the votes they get the next time around, if the engagement with these levels of questions actually drives results for them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's when you start to think through it, it is tough to do in the sense that you have to then sort of control for a variety of other factors, right? Not just speeches and debates and the spending of constituency funds, but I think it could be done, and I think it would be really interesting to see because it is something that, again, I have a couple of studies that look at this, and I do believe it's a real phenomenon. But when I talk with other academics or when my work gets peer reviewed, a lot of people express a great deal of skepticism, again, because the story that we've been told is that MPs don't care about this stuff, voters don't care about this stuff. And, I think we still need to empirically demonstrate whether that's true or whether those are sort of stories we tell ourselves about how voters behave in India that makes them not like voters in other places, which I'm not always convinced is true.
So, as you know, with any study, there are some results that sort of align with our existing wisdom and some that are very counterintuitive. So, in your paper, that you mentioned how, in terms of personal characteristics, for example, MPs with a university level education ask more questions about foreign security policy. Now, that can be easily say understandable, right?
Yeah.
But what is more interesting is that MPs with a military background, they engage less with foreign affairs. So could you unpack this result for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I'm still puzzling over because it was a very surprising finding. In a number of other parliaments, I think Spain is a particular example where foreign policy and defense topics, are dominated by those MPs who both serve on the relevant committees and have a military background. So to find a distinct lack of engagement in India is something that that needs to be answered. And again, I'm only at a preliminary stage in trying to work out myself why this might be. One idea is that perhaps because as career officers, they stay out of foreign policy decisions and they're not meant to during their serving years to express views on these things, that perhaps that sort of pattern of behavior continues over. But it's a really unusual, unexpected finding, and one that I've yet to sort of, as I said, develop for myself a satisfactory explanation.
Right.
Again, a small follow up on that. Could there maybe be something to explore on the number of members of parliament with military backgrounds in India? Could that possibly be a reason? And could that maybe create some issues with sampling bias or stuff like that?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is something that I did mean to say is, because the numbers are so absolutely small, the results might be driven by the fact that we just don't have that many MPs to kind of really draw a systematic conclusion from. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Just a related question, since we're still talking about this, there was another finding that actually MPs asked more questions about, say, defense procurement and contracts than issues related to Pakistan or China, which, as you mentioned, I think initially challenges the notion, right, that only electorally salient issues receive attention. So I was thinking, does this display a sign of a maturity in our strategic thinking in the sense where we move away from our neighborhood, but also see ourselves as a military power, as an end in itself?
Look, I think it does. And one of the things I wanted to look at in the paper was the distribution of questions, right? So, because one hypothesis that you could put forward is that, well, the reason that they only ask questions or that they ask questions about procurement and about defense contracts is to try to uncover corruption, right? It's a gotcha kind of behavior. Now, if that were strictly the case, then what you would expect to find is that it's primarily opposition MPs asking these kinds of questions and that government MPs or junior coalition partners wouldn't. But when I actually broke out the questions by sort of party type, you find whether the questions are strictly asked by opposition MPs, strictly asked by government backbenchers, or are questions that have been clubbed together. So you have some government MPs and some. Those topics are all still in the top 5 for all those categories. So I do think it indicates a degree. there probably is some degree of political, witch hunting going on, but I think it does indicate a genuine desire to probe and provide accountability, and it should, right? Because when we look at it, the defense allocation is such a sizable component of the union budget. And some of these big procurement programs, be they aircraft or shipbuilding, that's a lot of money. And the Indian people, the Indian public deserves, to get good value for their tax that they're paying into this. So I'd like to take the optimistic view and say that these people are asking these things because they matter. And again, they're more likely to be in the headlines. The stories of these big weapons programs or development programs are written about, so they do come to the attention of MPs. So again, there could be a slight selection bias. But I look at that in a very positive way to show that, there are a subsection, it's at least of MPs who are taking these things seriously.
Right. Okay, I have another question for you, Dr. Ladwig. You spoke about in your paper a little bit around the frequency of parliamentary sessions in India, right? And how it's significantly lesser than other countries like, let's say, Japan.
Mhm.
I would like you to expand a little bit more on this. Does this negatively affect the MP's ability to engage substantively on these topics? Because even out of these 70 days, a good chunk of that is taken up by the union budget and a lot of other matters. So do you think we would see better engagement or better discussions if there were more days in parliament, or if it was structured a different way? What are your thoughts on this?
I definitely think that it would improve engagement, it would improve oversight, and it would improve accountability for Parliament to sit longer. And one of the problems, and this draws on some of my other research, not specific to this paper, but very germane, is the creation of the departmentally related standing committees is explicitly discussed as a tool to help address this fact. So, yes, Parliament, Lok Sabha itself is only sitting for these 70 days, but these committees are working, throughout the year in the background, and that helps make up for it. Well, that sounds wonderful in theory, but there's a number of factors around the design of these committees that really limits their effectiveness. So one being that they are reconstituted every single year, right? So the membership changes every year. Now, again, I've gone into the detail, and I can tell you that some people get reappointed, so it's not like it's strictly 5 times in the lifetime of a particular Lok Sabha that it's a complete turnover. But on average, maybe 2 to 3 out of the 5 years will someone sort of continue to serve on the same committee. So the ability of MPs to build up subject matter expertise, particularly when we're talking about esoteric topics like foreign policy and defense, is quite limited. And that's not something, that turnover isn't something you have to have in a Westminster style system. That's a parliamentary rule. And interestingly, the UK within the last 10 years has actually changed, and they've gone to life of parliament committee appointments for this exact reason. So those things can change. The amount of resources that these committees have, limited staff and research support. So a lot of these things the MPs have to do themselves. They don't have expert staffs like you have on the U.S. is, again, an outlier in terms of how well resourced their Senate and House committees are. But, you could have a couple of subject matter experts attached to the Defense Committee who provide continuity, who have the resources to do deep research and deep thinking on topics. And then, of course, you have the problem of attendance. You have a few MPs who are at 80, 90, 100% of sessions, and you have someone who shows up at maybe one committee meeting in their entire time. And I don't know that that's a problem we can solve for because the MPs dictate their own schedules. But I think you can better empower those who want to take these things seriously. Because otherwise, what you often see is these committees do studies and they do try to provide feedback, but they're often revisiting the same topics over and over and over again, right? So it's always DRDO and the operations of the Border Roads Organization and personnel policy. And so it's kind of Groundhog Day instead of necessarily moving things forward. And then, of course, at the end of the day, they make recommendations and they can call attention to issues. They can't compel, and that's the nature, again, as we've already discussed, of executive-dominated parliamentary systems, but you can still enhance their ability to call light to things and to shine light on issue areas that deserve the media scrutiny. So I think a lot more can be done. And again, for the same reasons I've already discussed about the share of of the union budget that goes to defense, the importance of foreign policy issues, particularly for a rising India, I want to see good decisions made. I want to see the benefits of accountability and oversight that result in the best policy decisions.
Makes sense. Okay, I have another question before I hand it over to Anshika. So this is building on the same, right? So other than just attendance, do you think subject matter expertise is a matter of concern for Indian citizens? Because it's should in general, should we be concerned by the limited parliamentary expertise in foreign policy and defense areas, or is this common across democracies? And I think a little light on whether members of parliaments in India in specific and their educational backgrounds has anything to do with this, and should that be a cause for concern?
So, the first thing to say, and again, one of the reasons why I want to start looking into the Indian parliament is in a lot of areas of whether it's comparative politics or foreign policy, India, for many researchers, is just automatically assumed to be an outlier. So I remember talking to a colleague of mine who does comparative politics at King's, and he said if you tell most people in his field that India doesn't fit their theory of X or Y, they'd be like, okay, fine. We expect India's just different. It's fine that theory doesn't. And what I'm finding in this is that India isn't so different, right? What is different about India is that it has the same challenges as many other democratic states. It's just that the extremes are often much more extreme than you find in other places, right? And I think that tends to then skew what we perceive. So, it's absolutely the case that a lot of Western European democracies have very low numbers of MPs who have a military background. The UK has been on the downward turn. The US, it was a matter of significant concern in the late 1990s, very early 2000s. Now, of course, with all of the recent wars that the UK and the US have engaged with, we're seeing a lot more military veterans come back into Congress, come back into Parliament. So that sort of thing is on the uptick. But, it would be beneficial, given how large, the armed forces are as an employer, to at least see a degree of proportionality in terms of military veterans serving, because they do bring important, not just understanding, but credibility to raise issues. And I think sometimes because the issues are esoteric, because the issues are seen as ones in which the average person isn't on an equal footing with, the ministry, that you'd be almost sort of, who are you to even be questioning us? Who are you? You know nothing. We know everything. And then we have secret information and so forth. What's really interesting is that the MPs I've interviewed who have been quite active on foreign affairs and defense, it really tends to be idiosyncratic. I won't name any names, but, I've had them tell me, so why are you so into this? And they do think it's an important topic, but they'll often say things like, oh, well, when I was a kid, I read these books or played with Action Man, or I just thought it was a really kind of neat thing. And they carried that interest and curiosity with them into their adult lives. But I haven't been able to identify any sort of systematic explanation for why this subset of parliamentarians, will do these topics and no one else. But I think we need more, right? We need more people. And this is for all issue areas, right? You need to have the ability to ask intelligent questions of the government, because that's one of your rights and duties as a member of parliament. And it's one of the few ways that you can sort of hold the government to a degree of account. And so, I know other countries do have programs where think tanks will almost do sort of a boot camp for newly elected members of parliament or members of Congress to get smart on defense and national security issues, because a lot of people don't necessarily have them, and maybe that's something that could be thought about in India.
Interesting insight.
So, since you mentioned democratic oversight a while ago, so I was just wondering, what does your study say about the quality and nature of this democratic oversight in India, right? And in specifically parliamentary questions, do you see them as a viable tool of accountability, or are they largely symbolic in nature?
Yeah, so The first thing is to say that looking at this data across this long period of time indicates that there are people who are interested in doing this, that there is a willingness to ask questions. Now, questions themselves have limited. They're limited in what they can achieve, right? So they are sort of an ability to bring attention to an issue, often after the fact, though sometimes while decisions are still being made. And it's limited to sort of calling attention to something, right? So the government does have to respond. They have to give information on some levels. As I said before, sometimes the answers given by the government or the question asked becomes the basis of a news story. So questions can sort of drive attention that way, and then that puts more pressure on the government to either give information, explain how they reached the decision that they did, justify the choices that they made, and all of that is good. And we should hold governments to account for that. Sometimes, and it happens. The government answers questions in such a banal way, and by divulging sort of as little as it has to, that it sort of defeats the purpose. And there's not a lot then that MPs can do beyond sort of continuing to ask questions. So I think this is an area where I would love to see interested members of parliament think about their own rules and the sort of restraints they've imposed upon themselves, and think about ways that they could have a little more strength with respect to their accountability and oversight. And I understand that at the end of the day, the executive wants to get things done. This isn't a partisan political statement to say, oh, this party or that party. Executives want they need to govern. They need to get things done. They don't want to spend endless amounts of time. And we could imagine, if all 500 plus members of parliament were every day, questioning and delaying and, demanding, well, then we just have gridlock, and that isn't, effective. But neither is necessarily just letting the executive go completely through without any question, without any scrutiny, without any asks for explanation. So there's certainly a fine line to be done. But again, at the end of the day, I think as someone who believes in good public policy, accountability and oversight help drive good decision making, right? They help lead to better outcomes. And what I want as a scholar who works on this country is to see the best possible outcomes for the money that's spent, the times it's taken, the lives that are risked, and so forth.
Yeah, I think you've answered a lot of tangential questions in that one question. So just I think one last sort of very broad takeaway, and again riding on the wave of optimism that you exuded. I read recently, how if you want to understand the future and direction of a country, pay attention to the qualities and conduct of debates within it. And this includes how deeply the discussions are explored, the level of education of participants, and whether they engage in fact based arguments or whether they're focusing on entertaining surface level points to win approval, right? So, do you see a brighter future for India in terms of parliamentary discussions, especially given foreign and security policy, which your paper deals with, especially as we are positioning ourselves as a global power?
So what gives me a lot of optimism is the places like Takshashila and some of the other Delhi-based think tanks in really working to cultivate a younger cadre of scholars and researchers. When I'm not that old, but when I started doing this during my PhD days, often the foreign policy experts who were sort of wheeled out at various research institutions were, former General so and so, retired ambassador, this person, who sort of would just continue to repeat the views that were held back when they were serving 15, 20 years before. And so qualities of the discussions and debate were not always fantastic. And what excites me is the sort of the real proliferation in the last couple of decades of, let's call them under 40s, who are given both opportunities and space to write, and to put their research out there and to really cultivate positions, because then that stuff is feeding into the system. Now, we don't always know how well and how much MPs read or their staffs brief them, but we know that the quality of debate and discussion has become so much richer and so much more vibrant and also so much more ambitious for India. And I think that's an important part of it too, because that does still involve whether it works from the think tanks informing the media, who then ask tougher questions and try to raise the standards and raise expectations. At least in this area, I feel very optimistic. Again, I'd love to see more self-proclaimed foreign policy experts, elected to the Lok Sabha. But the fact that this ecosystem, is so much more strong and dynamic than it was, 15 or 20 years ago does give me some optimism.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ladwig, for ending on such a positive note and giving a lot of hope and courage to us young researchers. Thank you, Tanmay, and thank you to our listeners.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.